I walked into the courthouse with my children's hands in mine, and fear dragging behind me like a heavy coat. The hallway echoed with sharp footsteps and cold stares, and for a moment, I felt like I didn't belong there at all. My name is Emily Carson, and I was fighting for Jonah and Sophie, the only parts of my life that had any light left in them. Across the courtroom sat Nathan Ellis, my ex-husband, in a sleek navy suit beside his lawyer, Mrs. Whitaker. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. He had already painted me as a failure in every document he'd submitted. To the court I was poor, unstable, and unworthy. I had no lawyer, only a second-hand blazer and a folder full of papers I had collected late at night while the kids were asleep. Rent receipts, school notes, a letter from our neighbor saying she saw me walk the kids to school every day, even in the rain. It all felt like scraps against an army. The judge, a man named Lambert, entered the room with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too many families fall apart. As he took his seat, I felt my stomach knot. The hearing began, and Mrs. Whitaker rose with a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Your Honor," she said, "we are here to discuss the well-being of 2 children currently residing in conditions that are, quite frankly, unfit for any child." Her words came fast and rehearsed, backed by glossy photos of Nathan's pristine kitchen, private school brochures, and graphs showing income streams I could never touch. She made it sound like Nathan was the only parent who could offer Jonah and Sophie a real future. I sat frozen, clutching the hem of my skirt. I had nothing but truth, and in that courtroom, it felt as flimsy as paper. They said I had no steady job. True. They said my apartment was temporary housing. Also true. But they didn't mention that I boiled water to bathe my kids when the heater broke. Or that I worked 2 cleaning jobs under the table just to keep food on our shelves. They didn't say how many nights I skipped dinner so my kids wouldn't go to bed hungry. Because to them, survival wasn't enough. Only numbers mattered. Jonah sat quietly beside me, his feet barely touching the floor, eyes flicking between me and Nathan. Sophie was drawing on the back of a printout with a stubby purple crayon. I couldn't believe we were here. That this man who once told me I deserved the world was now trying to take mine away. I remembered how he used to say, "You don't need to work, Em. Just be here. Be a good mom." And I believed him. I gave up everything, my job, my friends, my own bank account. Then slowly he took more. He questioned every purchase. Controlled every dollar. When I said I wanted to return to work, he laughed. "We don't need your paycheck. Just keep the house clean." When Nathan left, he drained the joint account and moved in with someone new before I could even catch my breath. He filed for full custody days later. I didn't have time to grieve, only to survive. The court saw none of that. Only spreadsheets. Mrs. Whitaker continued, lifting documents as if each one was another nail in my coffin. "Ms. Carson has no verified income, no financial safety net, and no consistent support system." I bit the inside of my cheek. I wanted to speak, to stand, to scream, but I remembered what they told me at the free legal clinic. Do not interrupt. Do not cry too much. Do not appear unstable. Judge Lambert turned to me. "Ms. Carson, do you wish to respond to these claims?" I stood, my voice shaking. "I may not have much, Your Honor, but I love my children. I work every day to provide. I've never missed a rent payment. They're safe with me." It sounded small compared to the files piled up on Nathan's side. The judge nodded slowly and said, "Thank you. We'll take a short recess before continuing." As I sat down, I could feel the weight of hopelessness pressing into my ribs. My palms were damp. My breath came shallow. That's when Jonah leaned toward me and whispered, "Mom, should I tell the judge about the letter?" My heart stalled. "What letter?" I asked, barely able to speak. "The one I found in Dad's drawer. The one with numbers and names. I think it's important." I stared at him. In his small hand, he was clutching a folded piece of paper. A knot twisted in my gut. I didn't know what he had found. But something in Nathan's posture across the room shifted. Just slightly. Enough to make me wonder. Enough to make me hope. And that was the first time in that cold courtroom that I started to believe the truth might still have a voice. The air felt heavier when the judge returned to his seat. Every shuffle of paper, every quiet cough in the gallery sounded louder than it should have. I couldn't stop glancing at Jonah, who now gripped the folded letter like it was the most fragile treasure in the world. His eyes didn't show fear, only determination far too big for a 7-year-old. Judge Lambert cleared his throat, ready to resume the session, when Jonah raised his small hand. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "can I give you something I found?" The courtroom froze. Even the court reporter paused her typing. Judge Lambert looked surprised but nodded. "Come forward, young man." Jonah stood, short legs moving past the row of polished shoes and expensive heels. He didn't flinch. He walked straight to the bench and held up the paper with both hands. Nathan stiffened in his seat. His lawyer, Mrs. Whitaker, turned toward him sharply, whispering something urgent. I watched Jonah hand over the letter, my chest pounding like a war drum. I had no idea what was in it, only that Nathan looked nervous, more nervous than I'd seen him in years. Judge Lambert unfolded the page slowly, scanning the content with careful eyes. First confusion, then focus, and finally, a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. His voice cut through the room like thunder. "Mr. Ellis," he said, "would you like to explain this document?" Nathan blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Mrs. Whitaker leaned toward him, whispering fast, her voice sharp and clipped now. The judge held up the paper. "This is a financial strategy letter from a certified accountant, dated 3 months before divorce proceedings were filed. It outlines methods for asset shielding, offshore transfers, and income suppression." He paused and read aloud. "Ensure primary custody if possible, but at minimum, create the appearance of financial and emotional superiority to undermine her legal standing." The courtroom turned into a vacuum of silence. I heard the sound of my own breath, shallow and rapid. Sophie stopped coloring and looked up. Nathan finally stood, blurting out, "It's old, Your Honor. It doesn't mean anything now." "Sit down, Mr. Ellis," the judge ordered, voice like iron. Nathan obeyed. For the first time, the smug confidence he wore like a badge was gone. I wrapped an arm around Sophie without looking away from the judge. He turned his gaze to me. "Ms. Carson, were you aware of this document?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Your Honor. This is the first time I've seen it. And your son discovered it on his own." "Yes," I said, my voice cracking. "He found it while looking for his tablet at his father's house." Jonah looked up at me then, wide-eyed but calm. "I didn't want us to lose," he whispered. Judge Lambert looked at him with a softness I hadn't seen before. "You did the right thing, young man," he said. "And it may have changed everything." He turned back to the courtroom. "This hearing will be paused for a formal review of Mr. Ellis's financial conduct. Until then, primary custody remains with Ms. Carson. Mr. Ellis's parenting time is temporarily suspended pending further investigation." The words hit me like waves. I heard them, understood them, but my body couldn't move. It was Jonah who leaned into my side, grounding me. "Did I mess up?" he asked quietly. "No, baby," I said, finally finding my voice. "You saved us." Around us, Mrs. Whitaker sat in silence, lips pressed tight. Nathan didn't speak again. When the judge stood and the court was dismissed, I didn't move. I held my children close, unsure whether my legs would carry me if I stood. The impossible had happened, not with shouting, not with anger, but with a letter and a child's courage. Outside, the wind bit at our cheeks as we stepped onto the courthouse steps. Jonah zipped up Sophie's coat without being asked, his small hands working carefully over the buttons. I watched him, heart heavy with a new kind of weight, gratitude so deep I could barely hold it. He had carried that paper for weeks, never telling me, never seeking attention. He had waited until it mattered most, until someone needed to hear the truth. That night we didn't talk much about what happened. We sat on the worn couch in our tiny living room, the heater rattling in the corner. Sophie fell asleep on my lap, and Jonah curled beside me with his drawing pad. He sketched something quietly, not saying a word. When he was done, he handed it to me. It was a picture of 3 stick figures under a roof, stars above them, and the words "Safe Again" written in block letters. I held it to my chest, unsure if I was about to cry or laugh. In the span of a day, my son had changed everything. The custody case wasn't over. The fight was far from done. But for the first time, the scales had tipped and the truth had finally spoken, not from a lawyer or a witness stand, but from the smallest voice in the room. And that made all the difference. 3 days after the courtroom shifted beneath Nathan's feet, I received a call from the county clerk's office. A formal inquiry had been ordered, and a court-appointed investigator named Ms. Ortega would be in touch. I was told to prepare any documents I had about our financial history, household expenses, and any communication related to support or custody. I said yes to everything without hesitation. I had nothing to hide. That same night, while Sophie colored on the wall calendar and Jonah read a book with a flashlight, I stayed up past midnight gathering every scrap of proof I'd kept. Rent receipts, grocery lists, old emails, screenshots of unanswered texts asking for help. I labeled each one carefully in an old manila folder I found at the bottom of our bookshelf. Ms. Ortega arrived the following Monday. She was in her early 50s, with calm eyes and a quiet voice. She didn't smile much, but she looked me in the eye when we spoke, and not once did I feel judged. She asked if I was comfortable, if I wanted to talk alone, if I had questions. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Jonah did his spelling and Sophie liked to eat cereal straight from the box. I offered her coffee. She accepted. Then we began. She read every page I gave her. She took notes. She asked questions with precision but never pressure. Can you explain why you worked without official paychecks? I told her about the lack of childcare, the fact that no one hires single mothers with no recent resume for office work. I told her about the people who paid me in cash to clean their houses at night, how I used every dollar to keep my kids warm and fed. When I handed her the last piece of evidence, a handwritten letter from my landlord stating I'd always paid on time, she looked up and said quietly, "You've done more with less than most people do with plenty." By the end of the visit, my hands weren't shaking anymore. She thanked me, said she'd be in touch soon. I walked her to the door and watched her get into her car. For the first time in months, I felt the edge of fear dull, like I could finally breathe without bracing for impact. Jonah peeked out from behind the couch. "Was she nice?" he asked. I nodded and knelt down to his level. She was fair. And that matters. What came next felt like a storm unraveling in slow motion. Ms. Ortega's report came through within a week. She uncovered accounts Nathan had never disclosed. Money sitting in shell companies registered in Nevada and Delaware, wire transfers to banks overseas, and large payments made through cash that never showed on his declared income. Tax records didn't match reported earnings. There were gaps so wide they didn't just look suspicious. They looked deliberate. Every update she gave me felt like another layer of fog lifting. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. For so long, Nathan made me question myself. He was smooth, calculated, always 5 steps ahead. But now, facts were stacking up on my side. Facts I hadn't even known to look for. The day the final hearing was set, I received an email from a local support advocacy group. They had reviewed my case, and based on Ms. Ortega's findings, they offered to provide legal representation free of charge. I stared at the screen, tears welling up. For the first time, I wasn't walking into court alone. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom and brushed my hair with care. My dress was modest, black, simple. Not borrowed. My shoes were second-hand but sturdy. When I walked into the courthouse, I stood taller. I saw Nathan sitting across the aisle. His new lawyer beside him. Gone was the smirk, the easy confidence. He looked smaller somehow, as if the truth had already taken part of his armor. My lawyer, Ms. Davies, shook my hand gently. "We're ready," she said. And I believed her. Judge Lambert entered the courtroom, and the room settled. This time the power dynamic had shifted. The judge opened the session with a statement. This court has reviewed the financial investigation into Mr. Nathan Ellis and finds substantial evidence of willful non-disclosure, asset concealment, and manipulation of income to influence the outcome of this case. He paused and looked up directly at Nathan. This behavior directly contradicts the best interest of the children involved. I held my breath as the judge turned to me. Ms. Carson, in light of these findings and your demonstrated commitment to your children's well-being under difficult circumstances, this court grants you full physical and legal custody of Jonah and Sophie Ellis. Mr. Ellis will pay backdated child support and be subject to monitored visitation pending further review. I didn't cry. Not yet. My body sat frozen in stillness, as if waiting for someone to take it all back. But no one did. The judge signed the order. The gavel fell. It was real. Jonah leaned toward me and gripped my hand tight. Sophie looked up and whispered, "Can we go home now?" And this time when I said yes, it wasn't just a promise. It was the truth. That night, we made pancakes for dinner and played music through the statusy old radio in the kitchen. We danced barefoot across the cold tile, laughing until our bellies hurt. I sat on the floor, holding both kids close, and stared at the ceiling like I could finally see stars through it. Jonah handed me a new drawing, a house with 3 stick figures, standing beneath a single word written in crayon, home. The letter he found wasn't just evidence. It was a lifeline, a small act of truth from a child who understood right from wrong. And in a world built to ignore people like us, he made someone listen. He didn't just save the case. He saved our family's future. The morning after the final hearing felt different, not because the world outside had changed, but because the weight I carried in my chest had finally lifted. I still woke up early out of habit, listening for sounds that meant trouble, a knock on the door, the silence of an empty fridge, the echo of a threat. But that morning, all I heard was Sophie's gentle breathing and Jonah humming to himself in the next room. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, letting the stillness settle around me like warm sunlight through the curtains. For the first time in over a year, I wasn't bracing for the next blow. There was peace, fragile but real. I had won legal custody. Nathan's manipulation had been exposed. But I knew better than to believe everything would be easy now. Winning in court didn't fix the past. It didn't erase the fear that had become part of my muscle memory. But it gave me a place to start. I began rebuilding the pieces of our life with slow, deliberate steps. First, I found a part-time office job at a small bookkeeping firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it paid enough to keep the lights on without needing to count every coin in my purse. The manager, a woman named Lisa, had kind eyes and never looked at me like I was broken. She understood gaps in resumes. She understood what survival looked like. She gave me a chance. With steady income, I managed to buy a used laptop. At night, after dinner and baths and bedtime stories, I sat at the kitchen table taking online classes. I had always been good with numbers, but now I was learning how to turn that into something bigger. A certificate, skill, a future that didn't depend on anyone else. Sophie bloomed like a flower in warm soil. Her preschool teacher told me she had become more confident, more curious. She made a best friend, a girl named Hannah, and every morning she begged to wear her butterfly shirt to school. Jonah joined the art club at school. He started bringing home sketches that made my heart ache. Trees with deep roots, bridges over broken rivers, families standing tall under stormy skies. His drawing had become his voice, and every line told a story I would never stop listening to. Nathan, meanwhile, tried to regain control. He filed a motion to reduce his child support payments, then another to question the monitored visitation requirements. But the court didn't bend. The evidence had been too clear. His deception too calculated. He attended 3 of his scheduled visits, stiff and awkward, like a man trying to perform fatherhood in front of a mirror. After the 3rd one, he stopped showing up altogether. I never explained the full truth to the kids. They didn't need it. All they needed was someone who showed up and stayed. One night, as I tucked Jonah into bed, he asked, "Was it wrong for me to take the letter?" I paused, brushing the hair from his forehead. No, I said softly. You were brave. You told the truth when it mattered most. He nodded and turned his face into the pillow. I stayed a while longer, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. That tiny piece of paper, crumpled and forgotten in the back of a drawer, had become a sword of light in the darkest moment of our lives. And Jonah had wielded it with the quiet courage only a child could possess. I started attending counseling sessions through a program for single mothers. At first I didn't know what to say. I sat in the circle of women, listening to stories that echoed my own, and felt the tightness in my throat loosen little by little. I talked about the shame, the exhaustion, the loneliness that felt like a second skin. I talked about Nathan, not with hatred but with clarity. I told the truth piece by piece, and in doing so, I started reclaiming the parts of myself he had tried to erase. Ms. Ortega called once to follow up. Her voice was calm as always. I'm glad to see things settling down, she said. Your children are lucky to have you. I didn't know how to respond, so I just thanked her. After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched the wind stir the trees outside. I realized I hadn't felt lucky in a long time. But maybe luck wasn't about what you were given. Maybe it was about what you survived and how you rose afterward. I kept every document from the case in a sealed envelope tucked inside a shoebox at the top of the closet. Not because I wanted to remember the pain, but because I needed to remember the victory. I needed to remember that truth, no matter how buried, had a way of surfacing when it mattered most. That a little boy with big eyes and a folded letter could tip the scales in a courtroom built for giants. There were still hard days. Bills still came. Groceries still stretched thin. But the fear, the bone-deep fear that I would lose everything, had lost its grip on me. I walked differently now. I spoke with a steadier voice. I stood taller when I entered rooms that used to shrink me, because I had learned the difference between broken and bent. And I had bent as far as a person could go. But I hadn't broken. I had endured. And now, finally, we were beginning to live again. Months passed, and though we were still far from comfortable, the rhythm of our lives began to shift. There was no grand transformation, no sudden windfall, just the quiet unfolding of days no longer shaped by dread. It was in the small things, Sophie singing to herself as she set the table, Jonah reading aloud from his comic books, the kettle whistling on the stove while I reviewed my class notes. Peace I was learning didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, and I gathered every one of them like seashells on a storm-washed shore. My job at the bookkeeping office turned from part-time to steady. Lisa, my supervisor, started handing me more responsibility, quietly encouraging me to apply for a certification exam. You've got the mind for this, she told me one day as I reconciled a long-forgotten ledger. And more grit than most people I've met. I smiled without saying much. Compliments still felt like borrowed coats, warm but not quite mine yet. Sophie thrived in school. Her teacher, Ms. Barlow, pulled me aside one morning to say, "She's blossoming, confident, empathetic. She always asks if everyone else has crayons before she picks a color." I held back tears all day. It wasn't just that my daughter was growing, it was that she was growing kindly despite everything. Despite the cramped apartment, the hand-me-downs, the chaos of the past. Jonah, ever my quiet observer, had started drawing a series he called Roots. Each page showed a tree standing in different seasons. One with deep snow, one in wind, one in full bloom. When I asked why, he just shrugged. They keep growing, even when it's hard. I pressed the drawings into a folder and tucked it into our family box. One day I'd show them to him again. Nathan remained distant. His child support payments arrived late, sometimes partial, sometimes contested. But I didn't chase him. I had learned that not every fight deserved my energy. He still tried to twist the system, appealing decisions, questioning visitation protocols, but the court had grown tired of the pattern. After one hearing where he failed to appear, the judge issued a firm warning and upheld every prior condition. Jonah and Sophie didn't ask for him much anymore. When they did, I answered simply and kindly. Your dad is figuring some things out. And they seemed content with that. One evening, as we ate spaghetti at our scratched-up kitchen table, Jonah said out of nowhere, "I think I want to be a lawyer." Sophie laughed, noodles dangling from her fork. "You want to argue with people forever?" He grinned. "No. I want to help people like Mom." I smiled, not trusting my voice. I wanted to tell him he already had. That he'd done more in 7 years than many people did in a lifetime. But I just reached out and ruffled his hair. "You'd be a great one." Later that night, while the kids slept, I pulled out the court transcript. Not to relive it, but to remind myself how far we had come. I read the judge's words again, slowly. Asterisk. You demonstrated commitment under difficult circumstances. Asterisk. Those words didn't erase the hard years, but they acknowledged them. And sometimes that was enough. In my weekly counseling sessions, I talked more freely. I spoke of the way Nathan used silence as a weapon, how he made me feel small without ever yelling, how I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror during those last few months, how I used to think strength meant never asking for help. "You were surviving," my counselor said. "Now you're rebuilding." He nodded. Felt true. Every decision now felt intentional, purposeful. We repainted the apartment with donated supplies. Sophie picked yellow for the kitchen. "So it's always sunny," she said. Jonah chose blue for the hallway. Like calm water. We didn't have much furniture, but we had shelves for their books, a rug they rolled on, and a window that let in the afternoon light. On Sundays we made pancakes and listened to old music on the radio. I stopped counting every penny and started counting the laughs instead. One weekend I took them to the park where we used to go before the divorce. I'd avoided it for a long time, afraid of what it would bring up. But that day the sky was clear, and their laughter carried through the trees like it always had. As I watched Jonah push Sophie on the swing, I felt the final piece of fear slip from my chest. Not because it would never return, but because I knew how to face it now. Jonah ran over holding a dandelion. "Make a wish," he said, grinning. I closed my eyes, breathed in the warm spring air, and let the seeds scatter in the breeze. I didn't need magic. I didn't need luck. I had my children, had my name back. I had a life we had fought for and won. That night before bed, Jonah asked, "Will things stay good now?" I sat beside him and pulled the blanket over his shoulders. "Things won't always be easy," I said, "but we're not alone anymore. And that makes all the difference." He nodded slowly, then whispered, "I still have the letter." Turned surprised. "You kept it?" He reached under his pillow and pulled it out, now creased and faded. It reminded me that truth matters. I kissed his forehead and turned off the light. And as I walked out of the room, I realized something simple and powerful. Even after everything we had lost, the most important parts had remained. The love, the hope, courage. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were becoming something stronger than we had ever been. 6 months had passed since that final hearing. Time didn't race forward like I thought it would. It moved in quiet, steady steps. Some days still felt hard. There were moments when I caught myself standing at the sink, staring blankly at a dish in my hand, wondering how long I'd been lost in thought. But there were more good days now than bad. And that, I realized, was its own kind of healing. The court had followed up twice. Both times, they confirmed Nathan had failed to maintain consistent visitation. His last attempt to alter the custody agreement had been rejected firmly by the judge. I wasn't triumphant. I was tired. Tired of the paperwork, of the effort required to defend a truth that should have spoken for itself. But I was also stronger. The fear of losing my children no longer haunted every decision. My voice no longer trembled when I spoke in official offices or signed my name on legal forms. The kids began to build lives without hesitation. Sophie started ballet classes at the community center thanks to a sponsorship from a neighborhood fund. Her little feet stumbled more than they danced, but her joy was real, infectious. She'd spin in our living room until she fell over giggling, then demand a standing ovation from the couch cushions, and Jonah, who always clapped with dramatic flair. He had joined a weekend sketch group and started teaching Sophie how to shade shadows with crayons. Watching them felt like witnessing two saplings growing freely after years of drought. I finished my bookkeeping certificate 2 weeks before Christmas. It wasn't a grand ceremony, just a PDF in my inbox, but I printed it and taped it to the wall beside our family calendar. Sophie decorated the corners with gold star stickers. Jonah wrote "Champion" in block letters at the top. I left it there, proud and quiet. We were invited to speak at a support group meeting for parents navigating custody battles. First, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I could go back into those memories and speak them aloud. But then I thought about the mothers still sitting in plastic chairs with manila folders in their laps, hearts full of doubt and fear. I stood in front of that room, my hands slightly trembling, and told them about the day Jonah handed the letter to the judge. I told them about the free legal clinic, about boiling water in buckets, about the courtroom silence when truth finally found its voice. I saw heads nodding, eyes filling. A room full of strangers who suddenly understood exactly what I meant. That night, 3 women came up to me. One said, "I thought I was alone." I shook my head. "You're not." Jonah grew taller, quieter, more thoughtful. One day, I found him sitting on the floor, organizing a box of drawings. "These are the good ones," he said. "I want to show them someday." I asked if he meant a gallery. He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe just to people who need to remember what hope looks like." I kissed the top of his head and didn't say anything, because nothing I could say would be enough for a child who had carried so much and still grown so gently. Nathan sent a letter once. A plain envelope addressed to Jonah. Inside, a single sentence. "I'm sorry I wasn't better." Jonah read it silently, then folded it back and put it in his drawer. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. "Maybe he means it," he said. "Maybe he doesn't. But I'm okay either way." And I knew then, really knew, that my son had learned something most adults never do. Forgiveness doesn't always require forgetting. I kept going to counseling. I kept saying the hard things aloud. I learned that trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. I learned to stop apologizing for surviving. I started building friendships again. Simple coffee chats with other moms after drop-off. Group text messages that weren't about emergencies. Laughter in the grocery store aisle when Sophie begged for 3 boxes of cereal and I pretended to faint. On New Year's Eve, we stayed up late in our pajamas, huddled under a blanket fort in the living room. We ate popcorn and counted the minutes until midnight. When the clock struck 12, Jonah raised a plastic cup of juice and said, "To starting over." We clinked glasses. Sophie fell asleep with her head on my shoulder. I stayed there long after they drifted off, watching the stars outside the window, thinking about everything we had been through. I thought about how Nathan had tried to reduce me to a case file, a checklist of shortcomings. How I had once believed I had to look perfect to be believed. How wrong that was. The truth wasn't in the neatness of my life. It was in the fight I brought to the chaos. It was in every patched jacket, every missed meal I covered with a smile, every bedtime story read through exhaustion. The court had ruled in my favor. But more importantly, life had followed suit. Now, when I walked into a room, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. I knew who I was. I was the woman who faced down silence and shame and rose anyway. The mother who protected her children not just with love, but with courage. The survivor who became a builder. We weren't just fine. We were thriving, even if the world didn't see it yet. And that was enough. The shoebox sat high on the closet shelf, untouched for months. I hadn't opened it since the day I tucked everything inside. Court documents, receipts, letters, and the worn piece of paper that Jonah had handed to the judge. The letter that broke the illusion, that cracked the mask Nathan had worn for so long. I didn't keep it out of revenge. I kept it as a reminder of what truth looked like when it had nowhere else to go. That morning, as the sun filtered softly into our apartment and the kids were still asleep, I pulled down the box and opened it. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the folded paper, now softer at the edges, the ink faded but legible. It still made my heart pound, but the fear was gone. In its place was clarity, the knowledge that one small voice had cut through a system built to silence people like us. That my son had changed everything, not with anger, but with bravery. Later that day, we visited a small community library where Jonah's art class was holding an open exhibition. His piece was the first one near the entrance. A tall tree, split down the middle by lightning, still standing. At the roots, he'd written one word in charcoal. Truth. I couldn't speak. I only wrapped my arms around his shoulders and pulled him close. I'm proud of you, I whispered. He smiled without words, the way he always did when he understood everything before I could explain it. Sophie tugged on my sleeve and pointed to the corner. They have hot cocoa, she said with excitement only a 5-year-old could muster. We drank cocoa from paper cups and talked about their drawings and how Jonah wanted to learn watercolor next. I watched them from across the table, their cheeks pink, their eyes full of joy, and I realized I no longer looked at them with worry. I looked at them with peace. That night before bed, Jonah came into the kitchen and sat at the table while I finished the dishes. Mom, he said, do you think we'll ever need that letter again? I paused, wiped my hands on a towel, and sat across from him. Maybe. Maybe not. But the important thing is that we have something stronger now. He tilted his head. What's that? Smiled. Our voices. He nodded slowly, and then pulled something from his backpack. It was a school project, a short essay titled The Person Who Changed My Life. I expected him to write about a superhero or an artist. But as I read, I realized he had written about me. About late nights when I held them both after nightmares. About patching clothes and heating soup with the last can on the shelf. About showing up even when everything felt broken. I blinked back tears and looked at him. You really wrote this? He nodded. You're strong, he said. Not just because you didn't give up, but because you never stopped loving us. I reached across the table and held his hand. And you never stopped believing in me. Even when I didn't believe in myself. Jonah looked down, thoughtful. I think some people think strong means never falling. He looked up again. But maybe it just means getting up again. With your people. I laughed quietly, brushing back his hair. You're wise beyond your years. He shrugged. You say that a lot. Because it's true. The next day, I made copies of my certificate and applied for a full-time role at the office. Lisa had encouraged me again, saying the position came with benefits and more stability. I didn't hesitate this time. I had already proven myself, to her, to my kids, and most of all to myself. When I submitted the application, I felt a surge of something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Pride. Not just for surviving but for growing. For building. For raising 2 incredible children in the face of every obstacle thrown at us. We celebrated the end of the school year with a picnic at the park. Sophie brought peanut butter sandwiches she had made herself. Jonah packed a small sketchbook. As we sat under the oak tree, they took turns telling jokes and sharing dreams. Jonah wanted to design storybooks one day. Sophie wanted to be a dancing vet, which I figured meant she had 2 dreams, and she didn't see why they couldn't coexist. I lay back in the grass and stared up at the sky, where clouds drifted lazily across a deepening blue. And I knew, this was the life we had fought for. Not perfect, not easy, but ours. Made from courage, held together by love, and rewritten every day by the strength we found in one another. And somewhere, far in the past but never forgotten, there was a letter in a boy's hand. A letter that once shattered a courtroom silence. A letter that set us free. That was the day everything changed. Not just legally, not just on paper, but in my heart. That was the day I stopped surviving and started living again.